Welcome back to the investigative series where every ringing phone can be a cry for help or a cruel prank. Today, we enter part 3 of the Maura Murray case, where the story is no longer just about the white snow road or the cold forest, but echoes through strange calls over many years. And believe me, some of them will make you put your hand on the phone to check if there are any strange numbers calling you. December 2004, nearly a year after the disappearance. The Murray family's home phone rang at 2 a.m. Fred picked up. On the other end, a hoarse, shaky male voice said, "I know where she is." Before he could ask more, the line went dead. No number displayed. No explanation. And this was just one of dozens of similar calls the family and the police received, each one a piece of the puzzle or a false wall that led people astray. Just as the echoes of the abandoned car in the woods episode had barely subsided, a new element began to creep into the Maura Murray case: the strange phone calls. They didn't come in a big rush, but began like drops of water on a pond, creating ripples that rolled away. The first time, it was a spring evening in 2004, just a few weeks after Maura disappeared. Fred's landline rang. There was silence on the other end. He said hello a few times, and then there was a soft click. Someone hung up. If this were a normal story, it would have been dismissed as a prank by the neighborhood kids. But in the context of the family having just lost contact with Maura, every signal, no matter how small, took on an unfathomable meaning. And then, strangely enough, it happened again. Not once, but several times, at ridiculous hours like 1 a.m. or 5 a.m., when most people were asleep. The calls began to make sounds. Sometimes it was just breathing, very soft but persistent. Sometimes it was a rustling sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, mixed with the wind. The family couldn't tell if it was a prank or someone trying to send a message. And then one summer night, around July 2004, Fred received a call that kept him up at night. A man's voice, hoarse and a little shaky, spoke slowly. "I know where she is." That was it. No more, no less. Fred kept asking, "Who? Where? Who are you?" But the only answer he got was a long beep as the call was disconnected. Phones didn't display numbers, and at that time, tracing an anonymous call quickly was almost impossible for ordinary people. Neighbors began to hear about the calls and gossip. In a small town like Haverhill, news traveled faster than a winter wind. Each person added a detail, and soon the story morphed into all sorts of scenarios. Some believed the killer was trolling the family. Others believed Maura was still alive and had tried to report the call, but someone had stopped her. When investigators were informed of the call sequence, their response was cautious. They collected dates and descriptions from the family, but did not say whether they had traced the source. That only fueled public curiosity and fueled more theories. Keyboard detectives on forums like Web Sleuths started a separate section, the calls, documenting each case in which Maura's family or friends had received an unusual signal. One notable detail was that the Mays were not the only ones receiving these calls. At least 2 reporters who had been on the case also reported receiving phone calls from an unknown number, with a voice on the other end asking questions like, "Do you want to know what happened to Maura?" or "Don't believe what the police say." Some of the calls came from payphones in Vermont and Massachusetts, prompting speculation that the caller had moved around a lot or was deliberately trying to create false leads. One call in particular would later be considered by many to be the darkest spot in the file. It was on a December morning in 2004, when snow had already blanketed the roads. Fred answered the phone at 2 a.m. This time the male voice was not as hoarse as before, but younger and more urgent. "She's closer than you think." Before he could ask anything, the line went dead. He said his heart was pounding so fast that he had to sit down to catch his breath, because the words sounded both like a threat and a directive. But a directive to where? The police continued to investigate, but did not release any results. And, as usual, that information gap was filled with speculation. Some believed it was a suspect playing a cat-and-mouse game with the family and the investigating force. Others thought it was an undercover witness, too afraid to reveal his identity. And there were also those who believed that these were just malicious people, taking advantage of the public attention to tease. But for the Murray family, every time the phone rang at odd hours, the only feeling they had was a sinking heart, because who knows, this time, the clue on the other end of the line might actually be the one they've been waiting for all this time. And that's why this chapter is called The First Ringings, because it marks the emergence of a whole new layer of mystery, making the already confusing Maura Murray case even more like a maze with dozens of new turns, each hidden behind the sound of a phone ringing in the dark. If the first few rings were silence or indecipherable sounds, the next calls began to have voices, and that's when the atmosphere of the case changed. Voices, even a few words, could convey emotions, attitudes, and even intentions. But they could also mislead, confuse, or simply keep the listener up at night, trying to decipher every syllable. The first clear voice call came in May 2004, when Maura's sister, Kathleen, answered the phone at work. A man, not too old, with a northeastern accent, asked directly, "Are you Maura's sister?" When Kathleen replied, "Yes, who are you?" the caller replied, "Tell Fred to stop looking, he's wasting his time." Then he hung up. The statement was both a provocation and a psychological threat. Kathleen described the voice as not shaky or nervous, but calm, as if reading a prepared statement. Later that year, another call was remembered for its chilling quality. It was a close friend of Maura's, and this time it was a woman. The voice was soft, almost a whisper. "She's here with me. She's okay." The friend pressed on. "Where's Maura? Who's talking?" But the only response was a brief giggle, then silence, and the line was cut off. What was chilling was that the laugh sounded like a child's, but the previous voice was clearly an adult. Over the next several months, the family and those involved heard a variety of voices: male, female, old, young, some with distinct regional accents, some deliberately slow or stretching out vowels as if to hide. Some sounded hoarse, like a long-time smoker. Others hissed, as if whispering close to the receiver. One male voice, in particular, appeared 3 times, several weeks apart, saying the same thing: "She doesn't want to be found." The tone of his statement was consistent, almost certainly from script. When the FBI got involved in the investigation, they noted that some of the details in some of the calls suggested that the caller might know more about the case than was reported in the press. For example, in a September 2004 call, a female voice mentioned a blue box, a detail that did not appear in any public reports at the time. Police never confirmed what the box was, but the existence of this off-the-record detail led many to suspect that some of the callers were witnesses or even insiders. Of course, it was possible that they had gotten their information from hearsay or from someone close to the investigators. But if so, it would mean that information had been leaked. Psychologically, the voices were more powerful than any physical clues at the time. The family began to live in a state of heightened alert. Every time the phone rang, they hoped and feared. Hope that it might be news about Maura, fear that it might be another cruel trick. The internet, as it always does, quickly turned the list of voices into a kind of fictional criminal profile. Forum members debated which voices were likely real and which were fake, even comparing timbres to see if they were the same caller. Some used amateur voice analysis software to measure pitch, speech rate, and graphs, but no one could come to a definitive conclusion. While many callers were likely pranksters, there was no denying that some voices had something real, or at least something real in the way they made the listener believe them. And it is this mix of truth and falsehood, of valuable information and noise, that turns the strange voices into an important. In the world of criminal investigation, a call from an anonymous number is difficult enough to trace, but a call from a public phone is even more troubling. In the early 2000s, and especially in 2004 to 2005, payphones were still ubiquitous in many towns, on street corners, at truck stops, at gas stations, and outside convenience stores. Chest-high metal poles, painted silver or blue, with frayed black receivers, sat in the open, often unnoticed by passersby. They were virtually anonymous, invisible, and for those who wanted to remain anonymous, they were the perfect escape hatch. In the Maura Murray case, a significant proportion of the strange calls received by families, police, or journalists were traced to payphones. Their locations were not concentrated, but scattered across several northeastern states. A small gas station in Vermont, a convenience store in New Hampshire, a bus stop in Massachusetts. Each time a location was found, hope was raised. What if a nearby security camera had captured the caller? But the reality was often grim. Many gas stations at the time either had no cameras, or the systems had long since broken, or the tapes had been erased due to a policy of overwriting after a few days. The chances were even lower at outdoor payphones. Most were out of sight of any cameras, especially in remote areas. One famous case on the record. In October 2004, a 37-second call was placed from a phone booth at a rest stop along Interstate 91. The caller was a freelance investigator working on the case. The male voice, speaking quickly and softly, said, "Don't look in the woods. Look near water." The investigator tried to keep the caller on the line, but he hung up shortly afterward. By the time the police arrived at the phone booth a few hours later, it was dark and drizzling. No witnesses remembered seeing anyone use it, and the area was deserted at night. In another call, the source was identified as a pay phone in the lobby of a small hotel in Burlington, Vermont. When police approached, the receptionist said that several strange guests had been in and out that night, but could not recall who had been in the booth. The guest list did not yield any names that matched the person involved in the case. Many who followed the case began to believe that the caller had a good understanding of how to use a pay phone to avoid being tracked. Choosing a location far from the cameras, calling at times when there was little traffic, speaking briefly, using general but suggestive language. Using a payphone also created a special psychological layer. Unlike a cell phone, you had to dial directly, stand in one place, hear the metallic click when you picked up the receiver, and above all, you felt like you were in in-between space, not quite home, not quite out on the street. For someone who wanted to send a message in the dark, it was the perfect place to transmit and then disappear. Police tried to work with the phone companies that managed the public telephone system to compile a list of calls to the Mays and their relatives, but the retention period for public telephone records was very short, sometimes only a few weeks. So many records were lost. This only added to the fog that surrounded the case. On online forums, netizens began to map call points, places where mysterious phone calls were believed to come from. The map looked like a network spreading across the Northeast, each red dot a phone booth, connected by speculative lines like spiderwebs. Some joked that if this were a treasure hunt, the treasure would be buried in 10 different places at the same time. But to serious people, each red dot was a bloody spot in the records, and someone had deliberately chosen it to transmit or conceal information. The shadow of the payphone in this case is more than just a means of communication. It is also a symbol of an era when anonymity was easier, when you could just walk into a booth, insert a few coins, or swipe a prepaid phone card, say anything to anyone, and then disappear without leaving any trace useful to investigators. In the darkness of 2004 to 2005, those scattered public phone booths became black holes that swallowed up all clues. And to this day, they haunt all those who try to retrace the journey. In any missing persons case, the police often act as both gatekeepers of information and coordinators of action. With the Maura Murray case, and especially the mysterious calls part, the police treaded dangerous waters. If they said too much, they could reveal vital information or alarm the perpetrator. If they said too little, they faced a storm of suspicion from the public and the victim's family. In the months since the calls began, the police had been receiving reports from the Murray family about strange numbers, different voices, and even blank calls. They immediately opened a separate file to document each case, with the date, time, content, and, if possible, the source. But technology was limited, and tracing a call from a payphone or an anonymous number was not easy, especially when they were often so short. Internally, some investigators believe that at least some of the calls may have come from the same person. They rely on analysis of tone, speech rate, and word choice, but because they cannot be absolutely certain, they do not publicly confirm this. Instead, official police statements are generally vague. We are looking into all leads, including information received by telephone. This response sounds reasonable to the press, but to the public, it only adds to the sense of uncertainty. Murray's family, meanwhile, has repeatedly urged the police to share more, at least to know which calls might be credible. But investigators maintain that revealing too much too soon could ruin their chances of catching a suspect. Tensions between the two sides are inevitable. One of the most talked about moments was when Fred Murray publicly criticized the police on television, saying, "There were calls that they didn't tell me about, and I only knew about them through other people. It was my daughter. I have a right to know." The statement immediately caused a wave of outrage on the forum, dividing public opinion into two camps: those supporting the family and those believing in the police's strategy of secrecy. Meanwhile, keyboard detectives tried to fill the information gap with theories. Some believed the police had identified the caller but did not have enough evidence to make an arrest. Others thought they were following a group of suspects and waiting for an opportunity. There was even a theory that the police themselves knew Maura was alive but were in witness protection, and the calls were just noise to distract. In addition, the fact that some information was leaked to the press added to public suspicion. At one point, a local newspaper reported that the police had located one of the public phone booths used to call the Maoris, but did not specify the location. This raised the question: if the press knew, would the perpetrators know they were being followed? This also led to criticism of the way information was controlled. In fact, the police had tried a number of entrapment methods, such as asking the family to record all calls or arranging for an investigator to answer them posing as a relative. But because the calls were irregular and the timings were random, this did not have much effect. Moreover, anyone sober enough to use a public phone, speaking briefly and without leaving a trace, is also sober enough to sense when a stranger is on the other end of the line. By about 2006, the number of calls had dwindled, and the police began to talk less about the subject. When questioned, they often respond that most of these calls are not credible or most likely hoaxes. But that answer, instead of alleviating doubts, creates a new layer of doubt. Were there credible calls that were overlooked? Over the past 21 years, the police's failure to disclose the full data on strange calls has become one of the biggest points of contention in the case. And it is this gap between the facts of the investigation and the public's perception that has spawned a host of theories, turning the Maura Murray. The calls became less frequent, but the silence did not bring peace. Instead, it created a haunting void, a void that everyone involved, from the Murray family to the online community to the amateur investigators, felt drawn into. When the phone stopped ringing unexpectedly, people began to wonder, had the person on the other end achieved his goal? Or had he disappeared with Maura? Some believe that the silence was the message, that the cessation of calls was a way to lock the story, to let everything fade into oblivion. Between 2007 to 2010, records of the calls almost stopped being mentioned in the press. This made them all the more mysterious. On true crime forums, members began compiling all the known data: who received the calls, when, what the voice sounded like, what the content was, what were the signs. Some people made detailed statistics, numbering each case, marking the overlaps. And from here, a series of new hypotheses arose. Some hypothesized that the entire series of calls was just a malicious prank by many different individuals, completely unrelated to the disappearance, but who accidentally or intentionally interfered with the investigation. On the other hand, there were also opinions that believed that at least one of the callers was a real witness, or even the perpetrator. Some informal voice analysis pointed out some suspicious coincidences between seemingly different calls, such as swallowing words at the end of sentences or emphasizing the vowel a when speaking quickly. Another point worth noting: during the quiet years, there were still small events that awakened memories of the calls. For example, in 2011, a prominent true crime blogger claimed to have received an anonymous email that read "Maura is not far away," and claimed it was a digital version of the call sequence. The email quickly went viral, although no one could prove whether it was related to the case or just a clickbait. From a criminal psychology perspective, experts believe that the sudden disappearance of calls could mean that the caller felt an increased risk of being discovered or simply achieved emotional satisfaction after controlling the recipient's emotions. In other cases, the phenomenon of cat and mouse over the phone has been recorded, but rarely has this factor lasted as long and spread to the online community as in Maura's case. The Murray family, despite all these years, has never given up hope. If those people are still alive, I want them to know one thing. We're still listening, Fred said in a late interview. And if anyone has the truth, they should speak up, even if it means remaining anonymous. For many who have followed the case, this statement has felt like a message sent straight into the darkness where those voices once came from. Looking back at the entire journey of the strange calls, it's easy to see that they were not just a series of side events, but actually one of the undercurrents of the case. They both created hope and sowed confusion. Both opened up clues and blocked the investigation. And to this day, every word, every breath in those calls still resonates in the minds of those who care, as a reminder that the Maura Murray case is not yet closed. But this is only part of the picture, because when the calls fall silent, theories and suspect lists begin to emerge, opening a new phase, where more specific shadows appear and the darkest theories begin to be discussed. Follow now. Maura Murray Suspects, Dark Theories Emerge, True Crime Documentary, Part 4, where we will shine a light on every face, every name, every story to find out who could be behind this haunting disappearance. Don't miss it, because the next part will not only be theories, but could be the answer you have been waiting for more than 2 decades.